But I couldn't help but be moved by the kindness, compassion, and other intangible qualities that I saw in the girls I met. They reminded me of you, Marcia. There was no doubt in my mind that they possessed true loyalty, patriotism, and genuine hearts. Every soldier who goes to France has a girl to fight for. These girls make you believe that. I, for one, had given a lot of thought to the relationship between men and women during times of war. If it's a natural occurrence, then there must be some grand design behind it all. But if that's the case, then war must be inevitable and justified. It's a terrifying thought, and one that often leaves me feeling conflicted. But here's the thing. I overheard an officer tell a furious father whose 2 daughters had been harassed by soldiers that it's regrettable but not entirely their fault. After all, so many girls throw themselves at the soldiers. This kind of thinking is pervasive in the military from top to bottom. Women are constantly throwing themselves at soldiers, or so the story goes. And while it's true that some women are more forward than others, the vast majority of girls are simply misunderstood. American girls are typically wholesome, sweet, and kind-hearted. They're young and full of life, and the news of war has a way of awakening something in them that's difficult to put into words. But whatever it is, it's noble. Just the thought of a soldier from the time they're young is enough to make a girl's heart skip a beat. The sight of a soldier in uniform is enough to make any woman's heart skip a beat. With his athletic build, piercing gaze, and devil-may-care attitude, he exudes chivalry and courage. But behind the glamour lies a harsh reality. The soldier is preparing to leave for the trenches, to face the horrors of war and the possibility of death. And yet, despite the danger, women are drawn to him, willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of love. In times of war, emotions run high and women often lose their balance. The soldier becomes a symbol of sacrifice, and women are willing to do whatever it takes to support him. Flirtations turn into quick engagements, and sudden marriages are not uncommon. For the soldier, the love of a woman is the ultimate reward for his loss, the inspiration that drives him to fight on. But for the women left behind, war means sacrifice, disillusionment, heartbreak, and agony. They are the sinews and strength of defenders, the soul of a nation. And yet they are also its spoils, vulnerable to the advances of conquerors. It is a cruel irony that war both empowers and enslaves women, inspiring them to greatness even as it dooms them to despair. As a writer, I am overcome with emotion at the sight of these brave women, throwing themselves upon the altar of war in the hope of sending their great spirits marching to the front. No man can truly understand what they are going through, but we can all feel the change in our souls as we witness their sacrifice. In the end, it is their courage and determination that will see us through this dark time, and we must honor them accordingly. Every day I notice a change in my fellow soldiers. While they become physically stronger, their spirits seem to diminish. Perhaps it is only my perception, but I witness fear, anger, sullenness, moodiness, and shame. They are becoming increasingly indifferent to exhaustion, hard work, and pain. As their bodies toughen, so do their minds. The war looms in the distance, and it is closely linked to the present duty of making men. These men will measure others differently after experiencing sacrifice, obedience, hard work, and pain. They will become great because of it. However, I do not believe these things stimulate the mind. I, too, am changing. Physically, I am much larger and stronger than before. I weigh 180 pounds. My mind is always preoccupied with something. It wants to forget, to grow tired. Despite my best efforts, my desire to learn everything lags and often fails. I find myself drifting without thinking. I become an animal. The sight of blood, a fight, a galloping horse, or a broken leg affects me little until I am awakened to the meaning of it all. Then I feel a revulsion of feeling. With memory comes revolt, and I become the distressed, inquisitive, and morbid person I am now. The thought of what war will do to me is terrifying. Contact with the earth, exploding guns, fighting comrades, and striking foes will turn us all into beasts. It is wrong to shed another man's blood. If life was meant for that, why do we have progress? I cannot reconcile a God with all of this horror. I have misgivings about my mind. My dearest sister, I have some unfortunate news to share with you. The weather has taken a toll on me, and my cold has returned with a vengeance. 3 days ago, I experienced a 15-minute chill that left me shaking like a leaf. Shortly after, a sharp pain in my side set in. Despite the pain, I soldiered on, but now realize that was a mistake. I am currently in the hospital, a long shed with 3 stoves and many other sick boys. My bed is far from the warmth of the stove, and the pain persists, accompanied by a fever. I'm feeling quite ill. Please relay this news to Mother and Father, but spare the girls. Also, please know that this climate is to blame, not my own recklessness. Give my love to all, and do not worry, for it will all come right in the end. As I write this, it is nighttime, and the wind outside is howling. The cold and dismal atmosphere is overwhelming. The boy in the bed next to me has lost his mind. I think of you every hour and love you unconditionally. Sincerely, Stan Arquette. The poor guy. He busted his knee, but the doctors were too busy to operate. There's just not enough doctors for all the patients. And now he's going to lose his leg. He's talking about going home. Oh man, Marcia, home. I never knew what home meant until now. I'm feeling worse tonight. But I always feel bad at night. Only tonight it's different. There's a weight on my chest besides the pain. The sound of the wind moaning makes me feel so lonely. There's no one here and I'm freezing. I've been thinking a lot about you girls, Mom and Dad. Make sure Dad knows I did good. Jim. Chapter 25. The Smith family had received a letter from Jim that no one took seriously. His father shook his head and muttered, "That's not like Jim," but didn't say much else. His mother sighed, and his younger sisters didn't seem to be too concerned. However, Jim's sister Marcia couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her brother's letter. She had even written to Arquette asking him to find Jim, but hadn't received a reply yet. Each day that went by only increased her unease until she was constantly on edge, waiting for a response that never came. Then, out of nowhere, a telegram arrived from camp saying that Jim was dying. The news hit the family hard, especially their mother, who was devastated. Jim had always been her favorite. Mr. Smith immediately left for the east to be with his son, leaving Marcia to take care of their mother and manage their property, Many Waters. It was a lot of responsibility, but it kept her mind occupied, which was a blessing in disguise. Surprisingly, after a day of mourning, Mrs. Smith began to rally and show a strength that Marcia had never seen before. She seemed to believe that Jim had been shot or injured in some way, possibly during gun training or while working with horses. Marcia wasn't sure if that was the case, but she didn't want to dismiss her mother's theory either. They were all just trying to make sense of what had happened to Jim and how they could help him in his time of need. On the 5th evening after Mr. Smith had left, a message arrived saying he had arrived too late to see Jim before he passed away. Mrs. Smith was strong in the face of the news, but it was clear that it had weakened her. The family waited for further updates, but none came. Days passed, and eventually, while Marcia was walking in the evening, Kathleen came running to announce that their father had returned. He had called for a car to meet him in Vale. Marcia heard the car return and recognized her father's voice. She ran down to see him being embraced by her sisters and her mother leaning on his shoulder. "Yes, I brought Jim back," he said, his voice steady but low. "It's all arranged, and we'll bury him tomorrow." "Oh, Dad!" cried Marcia. "Hello, my girl," he replied, kissing her. "I'm sorry to say I couldn't find Stan Arquette. That New York and his training camp." He threw up his hands in frustration. Marcia noticed that her father looked thinner and more haggard, and his hair was now white. "I'm so glad to be home," he said, letting out a heavy breath. "I want to freshen up and grab a bite to eat." Marcia was disappointed that her father had not found Arquette, but she was more concerned that he had not said much about Jim. Later, her father seemed more like himself and explained that Jim had contracted pneumonia and had died without leaving any messages for his family. This news devastated Mrs. Smith again. Later, Marcia went to her father's room and could tell that something was weighing heavily on his mind. She felt a sense of fear when she saw the pain in his eyes. She begged him to tell her what was wrong. The burden on Mr. Smith's mind was apparent to Marcia. After some persuasion, he finally opened up to her. "Marcia, not long ago, Jim begged me to let him enlist right here in this very room. He wasn't of age, but he wanted to fight for our country and protect our home. We could see the eagerness, fire, and patriotism in him, and we were proud. Despite his wayward behavior, we let him go because he was a part of us. A Smith sent to do our part," Mr. Smith explained, pausing to collect himself. Marcia could see the pain in his eyes as he continued. "Jim was a natural fighter, but he wasn't vicious. He always fought for what was right, especially for his friends. Joining the army made him a man, and he would have made his mark in the war. He was strong, game, and fierce, but now he's dead. He died 4 months after enlisting, and he never even had a rifle in his hands. He never wore a uniform or an overcoat. Mr. Smith's voice shook with emotion as he spoke, and Marcia felt a burning anger inside her. "Please let me finish," he begged, his face turning red. "I spent all day trying to find Jim's company. When I finally found the tent where he lived, it was cold, damp, and muddy. His messmates spoke highly of him and called him a prince. They all owed him money." Marcia listened to Mr. Smith's heartbreaking story and felt a surge of sympathy for him and his family. It was clear that Jim's death had left a deep wound, and there was nothing anyone could do to ease the pain. He had done many good deeds for the boys. He only had a thin blanket, and he caught a cold. All the boys had colds. One night he gave his blanket to a boy who was sicker than him. The next day he became worse. There were miles and miles of tents. It took a while to find the hospital where they sent Jim. It was 6 in the morning on a cold, bleak day. It was difficult to get in, but a soldier accompanied me. Smith's voice went to a whisper, and he looked at Marcia with pity. "That hospital was a barn. There were no doctors. It was too early. The nurses weren't in sight. I met one later, and poor girl, she looked like she was going to drop herself. We found Jim in one of the little rooms. There was no heat. It was winter. There was only a bed. Jim lay on the floor, dead. He had fallen or pitched off the bed. He was only wearing his underclothes that he had on when he left home. He was stiff and must have been dead for a while." Marcia held out her trembling hands. "Dead Jim, dead like that?" she faltered. "Yes, he got pneumonia," replied Smith hoarsely. "The camp was full of it." "But my God, were the poor boys not taken care of?" implored Marcia faintly. "It's a terrible time. Everything that could be done was done." "Then it was all for nothing?" "All. Our boy and many others like him, the best blood of our country, Western blood, dead because— Smith's voice failed him. "Oh, Jim, oh, my brother, dead like a poor neglected dog. Jim, who enlisted to fight for—" Marcia broke down then and hurried away to her room. With great difficulty, Mrs. Smith was revived, and it became evident that the support she had relied on had been taken away from her. The strength that had kept Mrs. Smith going after the death of her son began to falter when she learned the harsh truth about the terrible loss of life in war. Smith, realizing that his wife was fading away, tried to explain to her the common illnesses, injuries, and deaths that occurred during wartime. He emphasized that more deaths came from these causes than from actual fighting. The weaker soldiers were eliminated, leaving only the strongest to survive. Smith claimed that the government was still sound and that the few incompetents and profiteers would be weeded out. He spoke of the enormous task of drafting and preparing a great army and navy which was beyond the grasp of ordinary minds. However, Mrs. Smith was beyond consolation. She had made the ultimate sacrifice for her son's fiery ambition to fight, and it was her duty as a mother to send a man to the front. Marcia, who had just dealt with her father's return, had little time to think about herself. Every day when the mail came without a letter from Marquette, her heart ached. She felt that there were impending troubles that would make the current ones seem trivial. Soon the mother was laid to rest beside her son. When the day was over, Marcia and her father sat in her room staring at each other with hard, dry eyes. The harsh reality of the catastrophe had dawned upon them. The war had brought them face to face with the futility of individual life. "It's over, Marcia," he said, his voice husky as he sank into a chair. "It's like a nightmare. What do I have to live for?" "You have us girls," replied Marcia, "and if you didn't have us, there would be many others for you to live for. Dad, can't you see now?" "I reckon, but I'm growing old and maybe I've given up." "No, Dad, you'll never quit. Suppose all Americans quit. That would mean a German victory. Never, never, never." "By God, you're right," he exclaimed, his face suddenly fixed with a trembling strain. Blood and life shot into his eyes as he got up heavily and began to pace before her. "You see clearer than me. You always did, Marcia." "I'm beginning to see, but I can't tell you," replied Marcia, closing her eyes. There seemed to be a colossal vision before her, veiled and strange. "Whatever happens, we cannot break. It's because of the war. We have greater tasks now than we ever believed could be thrust upon us. Your task is to show men what you're made of, to raise wheat as never before in your life. Mine is to show my sisters and friends what their duty is. We must sacrifice, work, prepare, and fight for the future. I reckon, he nodded solemnly. The loss of Mother and Jim changes this damned war. Whatever's in my power to do must go on, so someone can take it up when I— That's the great conception, Dad, added Marcia earnestly. We are tragically awakened. We've been surprised terribly, struck in the dark. Something monstrous and horrible. I can sense the danger that looms over every family in this nation, said Marcia. Dad, remember when I told you that it was all over for Jim? It was a woman's intuition. When I said my final goodbye to him, I knew it was forever. Did you feel that way about Stan Arquette? Her father asked. No, he will return to me. I dream it. It's in my spirit, my instinct for life, my flesh-and-blood future, and my belief in God. Stan Arquette's trial will be worse than death for him, but I believe as I pray that he will come home alive. Then you do hope, her father noted. Marcia, when I was in the East, I saw what women were doing. The bad women were good and the good women were great. I think women have more to do with war than men, even if they stay home. It must be because women are mothers. Marcia, you've given me courage. I'll take action now. The demand for wheat next year will be immeasurable. I'll buy 10,000 acres of the wheatland near Bert Arquette's farm, and my war effort will be wheat. I'll produce 1 million bushels. The next morning, Marcia received a thick envelope in the mail. It was addressed to her in shaking handwriting that made her heart race. Dearest, when you receive this, I will be in France, the letter read. Suddenly, Marcia felt a strange shock. The beloved handwriting faded, and the thick sheets of paper fell from her hands. Everything around her seemed to spin and grow dark as the sudden joy and excitement brought on by the letter turned into sickening pain. "France! He's in France!" she whispered. "Oh, Stan!" A storm of love and terror consumed her, taking down her fortifications of sacrifice, strength, and resolve, at least for the moment. Forced into womanhood, she felt fear and agony, all the while rejecting selfish love. Stan Arquette was in France amidst the trenches of war. Strife consumed her, and for a brief, bitter moment it triumphed. She bit her lip and clenched her fists, struggling to contain the impulse to scream out in fear and hate. She forced herself to think logically, returning to old, well-learned arguments, and slowly nobler emotions returned. Trembling, she picked up the letter once more, her heart fluttering high and sick, and her eyes blurred with tears. "I'll give the letter to an ensign who has promised to mail it the moment he gets back to New York," he had written. "Marcia, your letter telling me about Jim was held up in the mail, but thank goodness I got it in time. I'd already been transferred and expected orders any day to go on board the transport where I am writing now. I'd have written you or at least telegraphed you yesterday after seeing Jim if I had not expected to see him again today. But this morning we were marched on board, and I cannot even get this letter off to you." Her heart sank as she read on. "Marcia, your brother is a very sick boy. I lost some hours finding him. They did not want to let me see him, but I implored them, saying that I was engaged to his sister, and finally I got in. The nurse was very sympathetic, but I didn't care for the doctors in charge. They seemed hard, hurried, brusque, but they have their troubles. The hospital was a long barracks, and it was full of cripples. The nurse took me into a small bare room, too damp and cold for a sick man, and I said so. She just looked at me. Jim looks like you more than any other of the Smiths." She let out a sigh, relief mixed with sadness. Her brother was sick, but at least he was being cared for. She would have to wait for another letter to know more. As soon as I laid eyes on him, I knew something was wrong. They had told me outside that he had a serious case of pneumonia. Despite his illness, he was conscious and alert, and his gaze pierced my heart. "Hey, Jim," I greeted him warmly, extending my hand as I took a seat on the bed. Unfortunately, he was too weak to shake hands. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When I told him my name and that I was engaged to his sister, his face lit up with joy. It was clear that he was homesick and longing for family. I talked non-stop about everything I could think of. You, the girls, many waters, the wheat I lost, and so on. He hung on every word, and when I finished, he whispered that he thought Marcia had made a great choice in picking me. Can you believe it? He was curious about me and asked me questions until the nurse intervened. I was so happy that I could bring him some happiness and a connection to home. I promised to come back the next day if we didn't set sail. However, when I mentioned that we might not sail, he became despondent. It was clear that he was desperate to get to France. The nurse had to pull me away, but not before he weakly called after me, "Goodbye, Stan. Kill some Germans for me." I'll never forget the sadness in his voice and his eyes. Marcia, I don't think he expects to make it to France. I asked the nurse, and she didn't sound optimistic. She looked sad. Apparently Jim was a hero in his regiment, and when I asked the doctor, he was dismissive and brusque. He said that Jim was not in danger, but I don't believe him. I hope and pray that Jim recovers. We set sail yesterday, and leaving Hoboken was a breathtaking experience. The transport and the dock were swarmed with yellow-clad soldiers, making it look like a beehive. As we pulled away from the dock, leaving the good old U.S. of home behind, a profound feeling washed over me, perhaps second only to the moment you told me you loved me. I felt like jumping off and swimming through the green water to hide in the piles until the boat had gone. As we backed out, the thrills increased, and we passed the Statue of Liberty, but I couldn't tell how I felt. I gazed beyond the colossal statue, across the water and ships and docks toward the west that I was leaving. It was a feeling that comes only once in a man's life. First, I saw all the vast space, the farms, valleys, woods, deserts, rivers, and mountains between me and my golden wheat hills. Then I saw my home, and it was like looking at a magnificent photograph. A sudden rush of tears blinded me, such a storm of sweetness, regret, memory. At last I saw you, the very loveliest girl in the world, standing before me. My heart almost burst, and in the wild, sick pain of the moment I had a strange, comforting flash of thought that a man who could leave you must be impelled by something great in store for him. I feel that. I once told you that I would laugh at death, and that's what I shall do. But perhaps that's not the great experience that will come to me. As the sun set in the sea, way back toward the western horizon, where the thin, dark line that was land disappeared in the red glow, the wind blew hard. The water is rough, a dark shade of gray, and bitterly cold. I enjoy the taste of the salty spray on my lips, but many of the boys on our boat are already sick from the constant rolling. I don't think the motion will affect me, but it's so stuffy below deck that I try to spend as much time above as possible. When I came below just now, it was so dark that I couldn't see anything outside, but I could feel the wind and the waves crashing against the boat, and it made me think about the sea and how it's like my soul. There's always so much chaos and darkness inside me, and it keeps me from getting close to my comrades. I don't think they understand me, and they're probably afraid of me. They all talk about submarines and how scared they are, but I can't bring myself to think about that. What I'm after, what I need, seems so far away, even though I'm not actually that far from home. It's like I'm always searching for something, and I don't know what it is. It's Wednesday now, and it's getting harder and harder to find time to write. I'm always working or on duty, and when I do have a little free time, I can't seem to express myself. This old boat is constantly chugging through the waves, hour after hour, day and night. I can feel the vibration even when I'm trying to sleep. There are so many things that happen that I wish I could tell you about. The soldiers' duties and games, the stories that get passed around, the accidents that happen. But as soon as I sit down to write, they all rush out of my mind. As I stand on the deck of this ship, I am struck by the vastness of the ocean before me. Once I was afraid of it, but that fear has dissipated. The open deck at night is an indescribable experience. The grand, silent stars seem to know and understand, yet they are merciless. The starlit sea seems to be perpetually moving, trying to become still, seeking a level and quieting down to peace. But it will never be still. It reminds me of the human heart in its ceaseless movement. This voyage has been good for me. The physical life of a soldier has come to a halt on board ship. Every hour now is immeasurable for me. The mystery of life, death, and what drives me to fight the demon within me and the thing called war has made me realize that the truth is not unattainable. These dark, strange nights on the sea have given me hope and faith. But now we are in the danger zone. Destroyers surround us, and a cruiser is ahead. I am all eyes and ears. I lose sleep at night from thinking so hard. The ship doctor stopped me the other day and studied my face. He said, "You're too intense. You think too hard. Are you afraid?" I laughed in his face and told him absolutely not. The doctor suggested that I forget and mix with the boys. Play, cut up, fight, do anything but think. But he doesn't understand that the Germans can't kill me by making me think. As we near France, the air is charged with electricity. The uncertainty of what lies ahead is palpable. As we approached, an airplane flew low to welcome us, and the soldiers went wild with excitement. I have never felt such a thrill before. Watching those pilots up in the air made me wish I could join them. But I know I am not cut out for that kind of work. I'm too big and heavy, and I don't know the first thing about mechanics. No, my place is on the front line with a bayonet in my hand. It's strange, but I find myself fascinated by that weapon. They say we can't write home about the war, but I'll find a way to let you know what's going on whenever I can. Don't worry if you don't hear from me often, or if my letters stop coming altogether. You are always on my mind and in my heart, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep myself safe and come back to you. Marcia carried my letter close to her heart as she walked through the fields we used to roam together. She sat on the stone seat above the brook and watched the sunset, listening to the sound of the running water. As the light began to fade, she turned to face the slopes, drawing strength from their familiar lines. She knew that she had to focus on her duty now and work as hard as she could. The autumn twilight was cool and gray, with a melancholy haze obscuring the normally fertile valley. Night had already fallen over the distant hills, and there was no moon or stars to light up the darkness. It all seemed prophetic of what was to come, and Marcia whispered my words to herself, wondering if I would really be safe as long as I remembered her. She pondered the meaning of his words, trying to understand what he meant. She concluded that it had something to do with Arquette's unique spiritual mood. He had gone to fight in the war, offering his physical strength and weight to the cause, but his mind was not in harmony with it. Marcia believed that Arquette's decision to go to war was a sacrifice, and she prayed for his spirit. As the darkness crept in, she slowly descended down the long slope, feeling the sadness that came with the approaching night and the autumn song of insects. Yet there was a sense of faith all around her. From the black hills and gray slopes to the shadowy void and murmurs of insect life in the grass, everything breathed faith. The rough, fallow ground beneath her feet was a symbol of this faith, that even though winter would come and go, the spring sun and rain would bring forth the seeds of wheat, and another summer would see the golden fields of waving grain. Even if she didn't live to see it, life and nature had faith in its promise. To Marcia, the strange whisper in the air was the whisper of God, reminding her of the faith that surrounds us all. Chapter 26. In the midst of a chilly, damp French night, a group of soldiers trudged along the desolate, gloomy lanes. The faint light of stars peeked through the breaks in the clouds. The midnight hour felt surreal, neither fully dark nor light, as the men marched forward. The reality of their surroundings was in the indistinct hedges, the spectral posts, and the barren fields. The rain had stopped, but a frigid, penetrating mist lingered in the air. The ground was slick and muddy in some areas, while others held ankle-deep puddles of water. The soldiers' strides were short and sluggish, lacking any sort of rhythm or cadence. The group of soldiers marched northward with determined faces, full of the energy of youth. Despite the darkness of the night, their faces were visible, and they looked towards the horizon with anticipation. A deep, muffled roar echoed from the north, signaling the sound of war. The soldiers were 50 miles away from the source of the noise, but it was still audible. As they marched, the sound grew louder and more thunderous, causing the soldiers to fall into a hushed silence. The night was still, save for the sound of marching feet. The wind picked up again, and with it came the sound of detonations, growing in intensity as the hours passed. Finally, the sky began to lighten, and dawn approached. The day broke cold and gray, and the soldiers made camp outside the French village of Arquette sat with his squad, reflecting on the months they had spent in France. He had changed significantly, but he didn't realize it until he noticed his weight had increased. He had absorbed everything around him, and his comrades had become his brothers. At first they had teased him for his German name and aloofness, but they had come to respect him for his dedication to training and his willingness to help. Now they saw him as a man, all united by the physical life of a soldier. It could have been a coincidence, or maybe it was true for all American squads. But Arquette's squad was a peculiar group of young men. Perhaps Arquette believed this because he had been with them for a long time. They were a part of the New York division of the 35th, all supposed to be New Yorkers. But in reality that wasn't entirely true. Arquette was a native of Washington. Sanborn was a sturdy fellow from California with a clear brown tan and eyes. Brewer was from South Carolina, a lean, lanky Southerner with deep-set dark eyes. Dixon hailed from Massachusetts, where he came from a fighting family and had been a noted athlete at Harvard. He was a handsome, big, lithe boy with red hair and face. Purcell was a New Yorker from a wealthy family, highly connected, and his easy, clean, fine ways, with the elegance of his person, made him stand out from his khaki-clad comrades, although he was dressed identically to them. Rogers claimed the Bronx as his home, and he was proud of it. He was a little, almost undersized, but muscular youth with Irish blood in him. These soldiers were the closest to Arquette. Corporal Bob Owens arrived, throwing his sombrero down. "What are the orders, Bob?" someone asked. "We're resting here," he replied. The news was received impatiently by some and agreeably by the majority. They were all travel-stained and worn out. Arquette didn't comment on the news, but the fact was that he hated the French villages. They were so old, dirty, obsolete, and different from what he was used to. However, he loved the pastoral French countryside, which was so calm and picturesque. He reflected that soon he would witness the devastation wrought by the Huns. "Any news from the front?" Dixon asked. "I sure have," replied the corporal grimly. "Come on, you clam, open up," Owens exclaimed, bursting with news. He quickly shared the latest update on the German advance, but the reaction was different this time. Arquette studied his comrades, wondering if they felt the same way he did. He kept his thoughts to himself, but the rest of the squad had plenty to say. Some spoke with a hard, cool tone, while others were fiery and violent. But the predominant message was clear. They were ready to fight. Owens noticed the tension and decided to lighten the mood. "I heard a funny story," he said. "Let's hear it," someone replied. "It's from Berlin," Owens began. "Rumor has it that the Kaiser and the Crown Prince hardly ever talk to each other. But they met the other day, and the Crown Prince asked, 'Hey, Pop, what got us into this war?' The Emperor replied, 'My son, I was deluded.' 'Oh, sire, impossible,' exclaimed the prince. 'How could it be?' 'Well, some years ago I was visited by a grinning son of a gun from New York, none other than the great T.R. He was most interested in my troops. After he had inspected them, and particularly the Imperial Guard, he slapped me on the back and shouted, 'Bill, you could lick the world.' And my son, I fell for it." The soldiers burst out laughing, except for Arquette, who had been serious all along. "Arquette, can't you laugh?" Dixon asked. "Sure I can when I hear something funny," Arquette replied. His comrades looked at him hopelessly. "My Lord, boy, that was sure funny," Brewer drawled in his southern accent. "Stan, you're not human," Owens said sadly. "That's why they call you Demon Arquette." Everyone in the squad had a nickname, but Arquette's had stuck after several failed attempts. The first one was poorly received, and the second was a big mistake for the soldier who came up with it. Although he wasn't officially part of Arquette's squad, the soldier knew Arquette well enough to play a prank on him. He called him Kaiser Arquette, a name that didn't sit well with Arquette. In fact, Arquette knocked the soldier to the ground in response to the name. Despite feeling angry at first, the soldier quickly regained his composure and apologized to Arquette. He suggested a new nickname, Demon Arquette, which the other soldiers found amusing. Arquette protested, but the name stuck. From that day forward, no one made any references to Arquette's German heritage. The soldiers found it important to keep things light and cheerful, even in the midst of war. Arquette struggled to be the best soldier he could be, and he always felt like he was failing his comrades in some way. However, he knew that part of his duty was to maintain a positive attitude, even when things were tough. Each soldier had their own secrets and personal struggles, but they all played their part in keeping morale high. As men, they faced the daunting task ahead of them with determination and a strong work ethic. But despite their efforts, Arquette remained aloof and brooding, locked in his own internal struggle. He couldn't help it. Although he saw and understood the sacrifices and pain his comrades were enduring, he knew that his own ordeal was infinitely harder. While they held on to hope, he had none. "Boys," Owens announced, "there's a squad of Blue Devils camped over in that old barn. They just got back from the front. Word is not a single man among them hasn't been wounded at least a dozen times, and some even twice that. They're the bravest soldiers of the whole war, having been through 3 years at Verdun and the Marne, and now this awful Flanders drive. We have to go see them." Arquette was thrilled at the news. He had heard of the German-named Blue Devils and their feats of valor throughout his months in France. He remembered all he had heard and believed it, even though some of the charges and burdens attributed to these famed soldiers seemed unbelievable. Now, with the chance to meet them as they moved up to the front, he felt an intense eagerness and curiosity, a burning passion that he couldn't fully understand. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that he finally had the chance to go into the village. It looked like any other village he had visited, and the inhabitants, old men, old women, and children, all had the same somber eyes, strained faces, and oppressed look that he had grown accustomed to seeing. The villagers near the front were always saddened by the ongoing war, but they never failed to welcome the Americans with open arms. In fact, most of them were overjoyed and grateful that the Americans had come to fight alongside the French. Arquette ran into Dixon and Rogers on the main street of the village. They had just seen the Blue Devils. Dixon warned Arquette to stay away from them, but Arquette was curious. Dixon explained that the Blue Devils were an impressive bunch, but seemed to resent their presence. He believed that the soldiers who had saved France, England, and perhaps America as well, didn't like the Americans being there. Arquette was skeptical and decided to see for himself. He followed the direction Dixon and Rogers had given him and eventually came across a low, rambling, dilapidated barn in an old orchard. Clusters of soldiers in blue lounged around smoking fires outside. As he got closer, Arquette noticed that most of them seemed to be lost in thought, with a few busy with their tasks. Arquette's sweeping gaze took in the whole scene, and his first quick, strange impression was that these soldiers resembled ghouls who had lived in dark holes of mud. Stan was determined to make the most of this opportunity. This meeting would be of greater significance to him than anything else that had happened to him in France. The nearest soldier sat on a flattened pile of straw around which the ground was muddy. At first glance, Stan took him to be an African, so dark were his face and eyes, but no one paid any attention to Stan's approach. It was a poignant moment for Stan. His French was passable, but his emotions got the best of him, making his speech slightly difficult to understand. The soldier lifted his head, revealing a face that seemed to flash black, with piercingly dark eyes that held a deep, terrible shadow. He didn't seem to see Stan as a man, but rather as a representation of the clean, trim uniform of the United States Army. Stan repeated his words, enunciating more clearly this time. The Frenchman grunted and continued to scrape his worn, faded coat with a knife. It was then that Stan noticed the man's great hollow frame and the torn shirt stained with many colors, one of them being a dark red. His hands were calloused and rough, resembling those of both a mason and a saltwater fisherman. Arquette spoke slowly and deliberately, choosing his words carefully due to his unfamiliarity with the French language. He was eager to make a good impression, and his enthusiasm caught the Frenchman's attention, as well as that of his comrades. "We're coming strong," he exclaimed, his voice full of excitement. "1 million of us this year. We may be untrained, but we'll learn from you and fight alongside the English and French troops." The Frenchman then put on his coat, revealing his officer status and medals. The dark glance he gave Arquette was different from his initial one, taking in the Teutonic blonde features and an extraordinarily splendid physique. "You have German blood," he stated. "Yes, but I'm American," replied Arquette simply, meeting the Frenchman's gaze with his intense and fearless spirit. Arquette had never felt so tested in his life, his manhood and truth put to the ultimate challenge. "My name's Juan," said the officer, extending his deformed hand. "I'm Arquette," replied Stan, meeting the hand with his own. The Frenchman spoke quickly to his comrades, too fast for Stan to understand, but it became clear that they were interested in his news about the American army. After 3 years of war, they didn't want a fresh army stealing their glory. Arquette could see the soldiers' desire for glory in their seared faces. Stan was soon welcomed by the soldiers, exhausting his knowledge of French and being studied by eyes that had gleamed in the face of death. He felt the weight of the reality of war in the worn accoutrements, mud-covered greatcoats, claw-like hands, and hobbling feet. It was a testament to man's limitless endurance and proof of valor. As Arquette gazed upon the faces of these soldiers, he could see the history that had marked them. The boys who had gone to war had grown old in just 3 short years, and the terror they had experienced still shone in their eyes. But alongside that fear was a spirit of resistance that had helped them to endure. Arquette, with his intense and self-centered passion, was driven to prove something to himself. He felt a strange and all-powerful urge that he couldn't quite name, and it seemed as though the soldiers' souls were bared to him. Despite their calm and thoughtful demeanor, Arquette sensed that these soldiers had been through something unimaginable. He could see the significance in their weapons, medals, uniforms, and stripes, and he knew that their vitality had been all but spent. As he handled their rifles and ran his hand along the gleaming bayonet blades, Arquette began to grasp something intangible, a feeling that he knew he must attain. Despite his youth and inexperience, Arquette's impelling spirit of manhood inspired many of these veterans to share their stories with him. They spoke of the siege of Verdun, the retreat toward Paris, the victory of the Marne, and the Kaiser's battle, the most awful offensive of the enemy. Brunel shared his own story of being the last survivor of a squad at Verdun who had been ordered to hold a breach in a front stone wall along the outposts. The soldiers faced a barrage of heavy artillery, the deafening roar of whistling shells and explosions that shook the ground. Smoke, sulfur, and gas filled the air as walls crumbled and shrapnel rained down. Death came in various forms. Soldiers' lives were as fragile as gnats in the wind, burned by flames. Some soldiers' heads were momentarily suspended in the air, detached from their bodies by the force of an exploding shell. Others were blown up, shot, riddled, brained, or disemboweled. Yet their comrades stood firm, grim and unyielding, fighting through the rain of shells and smashing walls. Matthew recounted the Great Retreat, how soldiers marched day and night, eating on the move, sleeping while walking. They were bloody-footed, desperate, and terrible, driven by burning thirst and the agony of ceaseless motion. Despite their fatigue, they marched on and on with dragging legs and laboring breasts, red-hazed eyes, and unquenchable spirits. Sergeant Delorme spoke of the fierce about-face at the Marne, men whose homes had been invaded, children murdered, and women enslaved engaged in a ruthless fighting, swift and deadly. Delorme's own division engaged in a hand-to-hand conflict, running down upon superior numbers, routing them over a field of blood and death. Delorme then showed Arquette the French use of the bayonet, a trick that the Boche couldn't face. "Wow, you've got some serious skills, man," exclaimed the French soldier, clearly impressed with Arquette's physical abilities. "You've got the strength of a giant and the precision of a duelist. You'll make those German pigs regret ever crossing your path." Despite the praise, Arquette couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He couldn't help but imagine the bayonet slipping past his guard and piercing him from front to back. The glint of the blade seemed to taunt him, a constant reminder of the danger he was in. As he trained with the Blue Devils, Arquette was struck by their frank discussions of death. For them it was a fact of life, an inevitable outcome of the war they were fighting. Arquette felt like a child among savages, but he couldn't help being fascinated by the idea of man-to-man combat, of facing off against the enemy in a battle of wills. The officer Juan spoke to him in English, and Arquette hung on his every word. "You Americans have a lot of courage and determination," Juan said, "but you don't fully understand what you're up against. This war is brutal, and it will take everything you've got to survive." Arquette knew he was in for a tough fight, but he felt a surge of adrenaline at the thought of facing the enemy head-on. He was ready to do whatever it took to protect his country and his fellow soldiers, even if it meant putting his own life on the line. The terrors of war go far beyond what most can imagine. For myself and my comrades, the actual fighting is a release from the constant fears that haunt us. We have lived through countless horrors: wounds, starvation, shell shock, poison gas, fire, diseases, and the grueling labor of the trenches. Each of us carries a particular terror that haunts us. Some of my fellow soldiers have even gone mad from the echoing screams of shells. Others have stood on the edge of the trenches, daring the enemy to end their suffering. For those of us who hope to escape this war alive, it feels like we are trapped in the ninth circle of hell. Personally, I am haunted by the mud, water, and cold. I have spent so much time in dark, frigid mud holes that my mind has become distorted. When I finally emerge, the comfort of a dirty old barn or a patch of bare ground is so great that I cannot rest or sleep. When I think back on the past winter, I don't remember the injuries or the pain of my comrades. Instead, I remember the bone-chilling cold, the endless waiting, and the hopeless misery of the dugouts. These foul black rat holes were our only refuge, but we had to crawl into them through sticky mud and filthy water. The stench of the dead was always present, clogging our nostrils. This is what war is to me: mud, water, and cold, mixed with the blood and death of our own people. As I speak, I can't help but think of Les Miserables, a fitting comparison to the misery we endure. But I know that Americans will never truly understand the horrors of this war, and for that I am grateful. This is a burden that only those who belong to this soil can bear. He spoke of trenches dug in a swamp where they lived and fought and where the dead were buried. These trenches were their homes, even months after the fighting ended. The stench of decaying flesh permeated the air, and when the rain came, it washed away the dirt, revealing the rotting corpses once again. This soldier's mournful lament was a song of rain and mud, trapping him in a state of despair. He recounted the horrors of night and storm, where they lay flat, trying to dig in under the cover of darkness and rain. The sound of cannons echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. Hours passed like days, and death was a mercy compared to the agony of survival. On that fateful night, when a dozen men were buried alive in mud by a monstrous shell, and a refuge deep underground was annihilated by a similar projectile, a cloudburst flooded the trenches and fields. Soldiers drowned, their injuries and mud-soaked clothing impeding their movements. For those who survived, escape was a laborious and gruesome task. Around the campfires the Blue Devils rested, but the memories of the trenches lingered. Arquette looked at each soldier, noticing their similarities and differences. He understood the weight of their experiences, the trauma etched into their minds. He knew that he needed to endure some part of the war they had faced to gain any understanding of their suffering. It was evident in their restless steps, their prone forms, and their sunken, staring eyes. What warriors, what men, what giants! For 3.5 years they endured unimaginable fury of action and strife of thought. These soldiers of France were not dead or stolid like oxen. They possessed a simplicity that was almost appalling. They had given everything and stood in the way, bearing the brunt, saving countless lives. Arquette was taken aback when these words were flung at him, not out of malice but from their presence alone. The fact that they were there was enough. Arquette lingered there, loath to leave. This meeting came as a climax to 4 months of momentous meetings with the best and the riffraff of many nations. Arquette had studied, talked, listened, and learned. He who had yet to fight an enemy save a comrade or aid a refugee or child in this whirlpool of battling millions felt a profound sense of his littleness, his ignorance. He who had imagined himself unfortunate had been blind, sick, and self-centered. Here were soldiers to whom comfort and rest were the sweetest blessings upon the earth, and they could not grasp them. No more could they grasp them than could the gaping civilians and the distinguished travelers grasp what these grand hulks of veteran soldiers had done. Once a group of civilians halted near the soldiers. An officer was their escort. He tried to hurry them on, but failed. Delorme edged away into the gloomy, damp barn rather than meet such visitors. Some of his comrades followed suit. Ferrier, the incomparable of the Blue Devils, the wearer of all the French medals and the bearer of 25 wounds received in battle, sneaked away, afraid, humble, and sullen, to hide himself from the curious. That action of Ferrier's was a revelation to Arquette. He felt a sting of shame. During the war there were those who fought and those who stayed behind. Delorme, Maty, and Ferrier had nothing to do with the selfish, well-fed world of those who stayed behind. Arquette heard the cries of France, who knew that if the war veterans returned home alive, it would be only with shattered hopes, broken hearts, and lost faith. Their hands would be forever useless, and their bodies robbed by the war. As the darkening twilight set in, Arquette left his new friends and hurried back to his own camp. He muttered to himself, saying that he would never go back home honorably and well. He couldn't bear the thought of living with the knowledge he had gained unless he had risked and dealt with death. Arquette was filled with joy and exultation as he thought about the wonderful gift that the hours had brought him. He respected these soldiers, who were feared by the Germans. Like an Indian, he respected their brawn, courage, fortitude, silence, and aloofness. Arquette was amazed by the divinity that he felt in these soldiers, who were completely unaware of their own greatness. They had pride and jealousy, and the mystery of it all fascinated him. Arquette knew that when his time came, he would only last one short and terrible hour. He could never make a soldier like one of them, as they were Frenchmen whose homes had been despoiled. That night, in the tent of his comrades, Arquette reverted to his old habit and passionately told them everything he had seen, heard, and felt. His influence on these young men became a tangible fact as he stirred them. They became more thoughtful and sad, yet stronger and more unflinching for the inevitable day. Chapter 27. The idea that had been consuming Stan Arquette for months had finally become a reality. He had arrived on the battlefront in France. His company of United States troops had marched all afternoon, resting briefly at a camp of reserves before continuing on. The artillery fire had been sporadic during the march, and the once thunderous guns were now silent. However, the immense activity and the horde of soldiers behind the lines brought an eerie feeling to Stan's heart. The last leg of his squad's journey had been a nightmare, traveling through dark, barren space and deep, narrow, winding lanes in the ground. France had not yet become clear to him. He was a stranger in a strange land. Despite his tremendous interest and excitement, everything seemed abstract and dreamlike. The culmination of months of training and travel had left him in a nervous and fevered excitement, and now he couldn't remember any of it. His poignant experience with the Blue Devils had been a reality he could never forget. But now the blackness of the subterranean cavern, the damp and sickening odor of the earth, the presence of men, and the strange, muffled sounds were all unreal. How had he come here? His mind labored with a burden that felt strangely like a weight on his chest. A different and utterly unfamiliar emotion seemed to be rising within him, perhaps due to his exhaustion. He knew he needed to sleep before going on duty that night, but it was impossible. He couldn't close his eyes. Instead, he listened with all his strength, unsure of what he was listening for. In the darkness of the night, Arquette heard the distant sounds of thuds, footfalls, and muffled voices. His comrades were nearby. He could feel their presence and hear their strained breathing. Like him, they were locked up in their own prison of emotions. Arquette had always spent sleepless nights thinking about the two things dearest to him, Marcia Smith and the golden wheat hills of his home. But tonight he could only conjure up an image of Marcia's dim, pale phantom. He couldn't visualize his beloved wheat fields. The suspicion that something was wrong with his mind became a certainty. It angered him, quickened his sensitiveness, and made him despair. He ground his teeth, clenched his fists, and swore to rise to the occasion as he had always dreamed. Suddenly he felt something slimy and hairy against his wrist, followed by a stinging bite. It was a trench rat that lived on flesh. He flung his arm violently and beat upon the soft earth. The incident of surprise and disgust helped Arquette in one way. It made a literal fact of his being a soldier in a dugout at the front, waiting in the darkness for his call to go on guard. But it also proved his limitations and his inability to last long as a soldier. His pulse, his heart, and his brain all beat with a nameless passion. Was he losing his nerve? Was he afraid? His denial did not reassure him. The soldier, Arquette, understood that patriotism and passion were mere emotions, while the realities of a soldier's life were far more complex. He tried to focus on these realities in order to regain his courage, and his memories helped him to do so. He recalled the time when his squad first landed in Bordeaux, France, and how he had been thrilled by the welcome of the French sailors. However, he also remembered the strenuous tasks of army duties, such as training, traveling in cold boxcars, endless marches, and staying in camps and villages. One morning, an officer had ordered the battalion to pack up and go to the front, which had caused great excitement and joy among the boys. But the true significance of their mission had been beyond their understanding. Now Arquette found himself at the front, only a few rods away from the Germans. It was inconceivable, almost unreal. He thought back to the time when he and his comrades had watched their transport trains move away, and wondered if they had truly understood the idea of actual conflict at that point. He realized that he had made few friends among the inhabitants of the towns and villages where he had stayed, but had instead sought out sailors, soldiers, and men of all races, with whom he had found remarkable connections. The war had brought together people from all corners of the world, and Arquette's memory was flooded with all that he had experienced. Despite the mounting emotions and the knowledge of what lay ahead, he continued on with his duties, sharpening his mind and preparing himself for the realities of war. Passion had unleashed within him. He now realized that his eye was like a camera lens, his mind like a sponge, and his heart like a vast ocean. Out of the hundreds of thousands of American soldiers stationed in France, it was an honor to be selected for the battalion that would be sent to the front. Arquette only associated with his squad, but he could feel the envy of the entire army. How lucky he was to be chosen from such a large pool of soldiers to go out and finish the job quickly. He began to view things differently. Perhaps the soldiers left behind were the lucky ones. Despite Arquette's intelligence and spirit, something deeply personal, a selfish instinct, had always been present within him. It was the nature of man to preserve himself. The most significant ordeal and lesson of his experience in France occurred when he met the Blue Devils, and they welcomed him. No matter how long he lived, his life would be forever changed by his encounter with those great men. Arquette vividly recalled the night march over the endless roads, through the darkness and the eerie starlight, with the dull rumble of cannon fire pounding his heart. The minutest details of observation and a singular honesty of feeling were etched in his memory. Earlier that day, an officer had delivered a powerful and emphatic speech to the soldiers at the reserve camp, urging them to do their duty, obey orders, take no unnecessary risks, and remain vigilant. He had absorbed every word of the speech, but it all seemed pointless now. Afterward, there was a thorough inspection of equipment and a careful examination of gas masks, rifles, and knapsacks. Then came the order to march. Arquette had thought that he had forgotten much of what had happened that day, but he had recalled everything. The feeling of being lost overwhelmed Arquette as he surveyed his surroundings. He couldn't pinpoint where he was in France, nor could he determine which part of the front line he was in. He tried to ground himself by digging his fingers into the soft, moldy earth, but the sensation of something akin to a bone made him recoil. His mind drifted to memories of his old home in the Northwest, 6,000 miles away. It was a fleeting thought, however, as he was quickly jolted back to the reality of his situation. His comrades were huddled around him, each lost in their own thoughts and troubles. Arquette felt isolated from them, but he also recognized that they were all facing the same daunting task. The sounds of rustling and whispering outside the dugout door only served to amplify his unease. When a fellow soldier entered, the metallic clink of his rifle and the weight of his exhale seemed to fill the entire space. Dixon's voice broke the silence, and Arquette listened as he and Sanborn shared a brief exchange. The tension in Sanborn's laugh was palpable. "Well, as far as I know, everything seems all right," said one of the men in a low voice. "But it's damn strange. I wish we had arrived here during the day. Maybe that wouldn't have made a difference, though." Is it pretty quiet out there?" asked another. "Bob says so, but what does he know that we don't? I heard guns up the line and rifle fire not too far away," replied the first man. "Can you see anything?" asked the second man. "Not a damn thing and everything," interrupted Sanborn enigmatically. Suddenly Owens called out for Dixon, but there was no reply. Dixon's quick and quiet steps could be heard as he left the dugout. Arquette attempted to rest, but he could hear Sanborn sit down and stay still for a while. Suddenly Sanborn whispered the word hell to himself. "What's wrong with you, buddy?" drawled Brewer. Sanborn growled under his breath, and when someone else asked him curiously, he burst out, "I bet you guys the state of California against a dill pickle that when it's your turn you'll be sick to your stomach." "We'll take what comes," came the soft and quiet voice of Purcell. No one said anything else. They all pretended to fall asleep, too ashamed to let their comrades know they were concerned. Suddenly a short, dull, and heavy rumble seemed to break the stillness outside. For a moment the dugout was silent as a tomb. No one breathed. Then there was a jarring of the earth and a creaking of shaken timbers. Someone gasped involuntarily, and another whispered, "By God, it's the real thing!" Arquette wondered how far away that jarring shell had landed. Not far, it seemed. This was the first time he had ever heard an explosion so close to him. The roaring of the cannon and the exploding of the shells had been a topic of everyday conversation among his comrades, but the jar and the tremble of the earth were something else entirely. Another tremor shook the ground, followed by a distant explosion. Arquette tensed, recognizing the sound of machine gun fire. He had heard it before, but never like this. These shots were different, with a viciousness and intensity that made his blood run cold. Was it just his imagination? He wiped his sweaty palms on his uniform, but they were instantly slick again. He felt lightheaded, as if his willpower had been sapped. But his mind was alert, focused on the officer's warning from earlier. The sector they were in was alive, meaning an attack could come at any moment. The Germans were just a few yards away, and that reality was both terrifying and exhilarating. Arquette knew he wasn't a coward. He would face the entire German army if he had to. He didn't fear death or pain, and his faith was unshaken. But something inside him was making it hard to breathe, hard to think. He felt trapped like a mouse in a cage. The weight of his equipment pressed down on his chest, making it hard to move. Suddenly he heard footsteps outside the dugout. "Arquette, come out!" called the corporal. Arquette sprang to his feet, but his vision was blurry. He groped his way to the entrance, feeling his way up the ladder to the surface. The corporal's form was barely visible in the dim light of the trench. A cool breeze blew against Arquette's hot face as he followed the corporal, stumbling and slipping on the wet boards. He felt a sickening sensation in his stomach, unsure of the emotions he was experiencing. Suddenly a bright light flared up and quickly disappeared. A heavy rumbling noise could be heard to the left, and the ground shook. The corporal led them past motionless soldiers peering over the wall until they reached a dark abutment made of filled bags. The corporal climbed up breaks in the wall, and Arquette followed, feeling as though something was missing from his legs. Rogers was waiting for them on the other side, looking pale in the darkness. A low whining noise passed overhead, and a thump interrupted the corporal as he began to speak. Arquette tried to speak, but was unable to. The corporal led Rogers away, leaving Arquette alone in the open. The night was enveloped in a strange windy pall, with flares lighting up the horizon and a series of popping reports close by. Suddenly a rocket shot up and burst into a pitiless radiance, exposing everything underneath. Arquette let out a gasp that turned into a sob as he flattened himself against the wall. The fading circle of light left him feeling paralyzed with fear. He knew he had to be visible, and he waited for the sharp sound of a machine gun or the explosion of a bomb. But nothing happened, except for the fading of the flare that had come from behind his own lines. As he started to regain control of his muscles, a heavy boom sounded from the German side. It was miles away, but still too close for comfort. That boom meant a great shell was on its way, hurtling towards him. He strained his ears, listening to the cold wind that carried the sounds of burned powder, shots, rumbles, spats, and thuds, along with the whistles of varying degrees, all isolated sounds. Then he heard a strange, low moaning that grew louder and closer until it became an oh-oh-oh-oh. It took on a singing whistle, and then it passed him, not falling. The explosion that followed was a mighty blow that jarred the earth and sent a wave of heavy air flung afar. The soft, heavy thumping of falling earth followed. The shell had exploded close to where Arquette stood, and it terrified him. He was reduced to a palpitating, stricken wretch, unable to cope with the terror that had overtaken him. He had not expected this. Words were nothing compared to the reality of being blown to atoms. Death was just a word, but this was something else entirely. Somewhere out there in the darkness, a huge iron monster belched out this hell upon defenseless men. Unbelievable and sickening truth. Arquette's state of mind had robbed this moment of its novelty and excitement. His physical fear had caused him to feel panicked and nauseous with a horrible internal retching. His highly sensitive mind, akin to that of a woman's in its emotional capacity, made him imagine the infinite agonies that he might avoid. Every shell that exploded, every soldier's agony, all of it was his to bear. But he knew his duty, and as soon as he was able, he began to move along the short beat. Once he reached the end, he took a deep, shuddering breath and, fighting his involuntary instincts, peeked over the top. An invisible object whizzed past his head, cutting through the air. In front of him, all he could see was thick, pale gloom, with spectral shapes leading off into the distance. Flares ran along the horizon, illuminating smoke and jagged outlines. He moved to the other end to peer over there. His eyes were sharp, honed by years of habit, allowing him to see where others would only see darkness. The flat ground before him was devoid of any living or moving objects. His duty as a sentinel was to ensure that there were no surprises from the enemy lines. Arquette realized that he could fulfill this task even though he was in agony. The space before him was empty, but it was charged with an electric current. Wind, shadows, gloom, smoke, electricity, death, spirit, whatever that current was. Arquette felt it. He was more afraid of that than the occasional bullets that whizzed by. Sometimes shots from his own squad rang out along the line. Somewhere to the north, an Allied machine gun spat out bullets now and then. In the distance, a large gun boomed. As Arquette listened to the whine of shells, he couldn't help but feel a sense of irony. Shells from his own side were meant to save him, while those from the enemy were aimed to destroy him. Yet both were equally deadly. As a novice soldier, he couldn't help but wonder if he was any different from the unknown soldier on the other side of the battlefield. Was there really any equality in war? The notion that these were Germans, the supposed enemy, didn't make much sense to him when faced with the reality of death. As dawn broke, the sky was smoky and raw. The thunder of shells spread in a circle around the horizon. Arquette was relieved to be on his way back, passing by Purcell at the nearest post. The elegant New Yorker appeared calm on the outside, but in the gray dawn he looked haggard and drawn, much older than before. Arquette couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the rest of his squad. Dixon gave him a penetrating look as if he was wearing a mask of youth that had now been betrayed by the reality of war. The single night had contained years, more than years. Chapter 28. Arquette and his fellow soldiers were constantly on high alert for an imminent attack. The Germans were probing the front line, likely trying to confirm rumors of American troops taking over the sector. Although they had yet to confirm this intel, the soldiers were subjected to regular gas shell attacks, which made breathing a constant struggle. The constant barrage of explosive shells made it impossible for the soldiers to let their guard down. Their once lively and healthy faces now appeared drawn and haggard. One evening during a lull in the fighting, Rogers was recounting a mission to his comrades outside their dugout. He explained that they had been given orders to stop a German patrol from crossing into their territory. They crawled on their bellies, constantly on alert until they heard the sound of men working with wire in the distance. Suddenly, a calcium flare lit up the sky, exposing their position and the nearby German embankments. The machine gun fire that followed was deafening. The bullets whizzed over their heads, narrowly missing them. Despite their fear, they managed to crawl back to safety, their nerves on edge. Owens, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal, urged them to keep moving forward. The soldiers were relieved to have survived the mission, but the experience left them shaken. They knew that the enemy was always watching and waiting for any opportunity to strike. As we neared our line, Smith suddenly jumped up and ran. Later he admitted that he couldn't help himself. The tension was unbearable. I understand. I used to work as a clerk in a bank, you know. And here I was, being pelted with bullets by the enemy, completely unaware of how much time had passed since I left my old job to fight in the war. It's strange how I could still picture my old desk in my mind. Anyway, that's how Smith got his injury. I heard the bullets hit him, thick and soft. It made my skin crawl. Owens and I dragged him to safety and finally into the trench. He had been shot in the shoulder and leg, but I think he'll pull through. Let me tell you, boys, no one can prepare you for what it's like to face a machine gun. A rifle is one thing. You can tell when the enemy has to reload and aim. But a machine gun? It's like being combed by a fine-toothed comb, and you're the louse it's after. You hear that constant rattle, and then the bullets are everywhere. It's not a fair fight, a man against a machine gun. Dixon was listening in, and he chuckled. Rogers, I wish I had been there with you. Next time I'll volunteer. I joined up for the action, not to stand around and wait. My years of playing football have made me crave action. Otherwise I get bored and restless. Last night, before you went on that scouting trip, I had been on duty for 2 hours. It was nearly midnight, and the shelling had stopped. Everything was quiet, no flares, no flashes, just a faint glow from the moonlight through the clouds. I had to stay alert, but my mind kept wandering. As a soldier, I found myself facing no man's land, a dark space that separated us from the Huns, who we considered less than human due to their brutality. As I stood there, I couldn't help but think of home. It's a feeling that no one truly understands until they've stood guard in the dead of night, alone with their thoughts. For me, thinking of home brought up memories of my girl. I'd been gone for 4 months, but it felt like an eternity. Last night in the darkness, she came to me. It was as if she was reproaching me for enlisting, just as she had when I left. She wasn't the type of girl to swear she would die alone if I didn't return from war. Instead, she begged me to stay home, or at least wait for the draft. But I couldn't resist the call to serve my country. My girl was a peach, and she had many admirers. Two in particular made me run my best down the stretch to win her over. One was club-footed and couldn't fight, and the other was all talk and no action. But she fell for him, the damn slacker. Sometimes I wish I could believe that I'll make it back home safely with a few Huns to my credit, a croix de guerre, and an officer's uniform. It would be great to show up those fellows who didn't have the courage to fight. But deep down, I know that I'll probably get killed. It's just a matter of time before my luck runs out and she'll end up marrying one of the men who stayed home. As I stood there, lost in my thoughts, it was about the middle of a clear morning. It was still cold, but the sun was shining and the guns were speaking intermittently. The soldiers who weren't on duty held their gas masks in their hands as they gazed up at the sky. Arquette sat apart from them, also looking up. He was so engrossed that he didn't hear the occasional sound of a distant gun. He was watching the airmen at work, the most incredible and renowned feature of the war. It completely captivated Arquette. As a child, he had loved watching the golden eagles soar, and once he had seen a condor with wide wings swoop along a mountain crest. He had envied them their freedom in the sky, the isolation of the unscalable crags, and the companionship of the clouds. Here he gazed and marveled at the man-eagles of the air. German planes had flown over the lines, high in the sky, and English planes had flown up to intercept them. One was rising not far away, climbing quickly like a fishhawk with prey in its claws. Its color, framework, propeller, and aviator were all clearly visible against the sky. The buzzing, high-pitched drone of its motor floated down. The other airplanes, high above, no longer looked like man-driven machines. They were now the eagles of the air. They were rising, circling, and diving in maneuvers that Arquette knew meant pursuit. But he couldn't understand these movements. To him, the air battle looked like two birds of prey in combat. Arquette remembered verses he had learned as a child, written by a poet who sang of future wars in the air. What he prophesied had come true. Was there not a wise man now who could see into the future and sing of the sacredness of human life? Arquette had his doubts. Poets and dreamers didn't appear to be the ones who could stop materialism. Strangely, as Arquette gazed bitterly up at these fierce flyers who fought in the heavens, he remembered the story of the 3 wise men and of Bethlehem. On this sunny spring morning, Bert and the love between men were nowhere to be found. Instead, a thrilling and terrible sight unfolded before Arquette's powerful eyes. One of the forward aeroplanes, drifting back over enemy lines, lost its graceful movement and began to pitch and change shape. A puff of smoke and tiny specks falling from the plane signaled its sheer downward descent. Arquette and his comrades stood in awe, barely able to contain their excitement and follow orders not to yell aloud. As the doomed plane disappeared from sight, Arquette felt a pulsating wave of gushing blood go over him, and he began to wave his arms and stamp his feet in frenzy. The other planes drifted away, and Arquette was left with a sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach. He pitied the destroyed airman and hated himself for feeling savage joy in his comrades' excitement. After being relieved from his guard duties, Arquette rushed back to the dugout and crawled into a hidden corner where he lay clammy and wet all over. Even with his eyes shut, he couldn't escape the horrific image burned into his mind. "So help me God," he whispered to himself. It had taken 6 months of preparation for a single moment that changed everything. His life, both on earth and beyond, would never be the same. He couldn't help but sob as he felt the disintegrating, agonizing, and irremediable forces at work on his body, mind, and soul. He had killed his first German soldier, and the fires of hell erupted in the no-man's land that separated the warring sides. Thunderous guns roared from holes where soldiers hid, filling the air with smoke and the screeching of iron. The barren strip of land shook as if from repeated earthquakes, and huge spouts of black and yellow earth lifted like fountains to the dull, heavy bursts of shells. The sounds of pound and jar, whistle and whine, long, broken rumble, and the rattling concatenation of quick shots filled the air like an exploding hailstorm of iron. Thousands of puffs of smoke shot up and swelled and drifted over the desert, and the sliding crash far away and the sibilant hiss swift overhead were deafening. Boom, wee-ee-oo from the east, boom, wee-ee-oo from the west. The sun set, but there was no let-up. The night was even more hideous, with hot sheets of lightning illuminating the murky sky. Wagons drove toward the front, and patrols of soldiers ran toward some point, and great upheavals of earth spread high. The heavy cannonading died away in the middle of the night until an hour before dawn, when it began again with redoubled fury and lasted until daybreak. Arquette stood on guard at a fighting post, with Corporal Owens lying wounded slightly at his feet. He was relieved when dawn finally arrived, as it meant a charge. Another night of that hellish shrieking and bursting of shells would surely kill his mind, if not his body. He refused to retire. After the cannons ceased, he drifted off to sleep. Rogers stood by his side, with Dixon on the other. The squad had survived that dreadful night. Soldiers were bringing them food and drinks, and all seemed to be in high spirits. However, Arquette was not. He knew that this was the day he would stare death in the face and laugh. A sluggish, slow heat burned deep inside him like a smoldering fire, fierce and intense at its core, waiting for the wind to ignite it. As he watched, he did not move a muscle, but his entire body twitched like that of a well-trained athlete, ready to take part in the most significant race of his life. An officer rushed through, and the talking abruptly stopped. The guards, with their backs to the trench, never took their eyes off the forbidden land ahead of them. The officer spoke, and everyone listened intently. The reserves were close by, and he gave his orders before hurrying off. Suddenly, an Allied gun opened up with a loud boom, and the shell whistled past them. Arquette saw where it hit, causing smoke and earth to rise into the air. It must have been a signal for a bombardment of the enemy all along this sector, because big and small guns began to thunder and crack. The scene before Arquette's keen eyes was one that he found to be incredible. Far across no man's land, which sloped somewhat at that point in the plain, he saw the movement of troops and guns. His vision was telescopic. Over there the ground looked grassy in places, with green ridges rising and patches of brush and straggling trees standing out clearly. Dim, gray-colored squads of soldiers passed in sight with helmets flashing in the sun. Guns were being hauled forward, and mounted horsemen dashed here and there, disappearing and reappearing. All through that vast area of color and action, live black spouts of earth crowned in white smoke shot up, and they were breathtaking, these shell bursts. As the battle raged on, the sky was filled with round balls of white smoke that drifted and spread. Streaks of yellow rose up, and dirty clouds leaped into the air, blending together to create a savage and sinister scene. The explosions were massive, creamy yellow geysers that detached from the earth and floated away gracefully on the wind. It was a sinister beauty, but Arquette soon lost sight of it. His focus was drawn to a dark, uneven break in the earth a few rods away. He could see spots and dots, shiny and elusive, bobbing along behind the mounds and beyond the banks. Suddenly a yell rang out from his squad, and Arquette's attention turned to the charging German soldiers. The Huns were many, but wide apart, running low and fast towards them. Machine gun rattles, rifle fire, and strangled shouts filled the air as the gray advancing line thinned at points opposite the machine guns. Arquette cursed his hard, fumbling hands as he struggled to aim and fire his rifle. Shot after shot he missed, unable to hit a field full of Huns. The sound of the charging soldiers was deafening, a mix of battle cry, yell, and chant all rolled into one. Beside him, Corporal Owens rose bareheaded to call low and fiercely to his men. Arquette gripped his rifle and leaned against the boards and bags, the intensity of the moment hard under his grip. The Huns were getting closer, and Arquette's heart pounded in his chest as he continued to fire, hoping to hit his target. He struggled with the shells, fumbling at the breech, loading haphazardly, aiming at nothing in particular, and pulling the trigger with a convulsive force. His mind was ablaze with a great and fruitless desire. The sound of the gunfire and explosions filled his ears. The gray, solid, unyielding Huns needed to be pushed back. Arquette loaded his rifle, steadied his aim, and fired at a large gray mass. The Hun fell out of the advancing line. The sight nearly overwhelmed Arquette. He was dizzy, his eyes blurred, and he leaned over his gun. His stomach and chest heaved, and he choked on his bile. He almost passed out. But the violence around him, the heaps of dust and gravel thrown over him, and the hoarse, wild cries in his ears brought him back. The Boches were on the line. He jumped up. Through the dust he saw bulky gray figures charging towards him. They charged as if they were controlled by one mind. Bulky blond men, their faces ashen, with eyes of blue fire and cruel, set mouths. The Huns. His comrades sprang up out of the shallow trench on each side of Arquette. They weren't rats to be trapped in a hole. Arquette felt as if he was being pulled by powerful chains. He didn't even need to climb. 4 large Germans appeared on the embankment of sandbags at the same time. They were shooting. One of them lifted his arm and clenched his fist. He screamed like a demon. He was a bomb thrower. In an instant, a bullet hit Arquette, tearing at the side of his head, stinging him agonizingly, knocking him down and drenching his face with blood. The impact held him down like a weight, but he wasn't disoriented. A body dressed in khaki rolled down next to him, convulsively thrashing against him. He sprang up, his ears filled with a harsh clicking noise, and his heart strangely lifted in his chest. Only one German remained on the embankment of sandbags, and he was the bomb thrower. The others were down, gray figures wrestling with brown. Dixon charged at the bomb thrower, thrusting his bayonet through the man's belly. The bomb exploded, sending Dixon flying through the air like a leaf in a gale. Little Rogers was locked in combat with a towering enemy, swinging and cracking their guns together before being stabbed in the back by another German. As Rogers fell towards Arquette, the dormant inhibitions in Arquette vanished. He lunged at the murderer with his bayonet and rifle barrel, thrusting them through the German's body with such force that he was thrown back like a battering ram. Arquette then turned his attention to the other German, ripping open his body with one mighty slash. Owens lay alive but stricken while Purcell fought off several foes with his clubbed rifle, and Brewer was being beaten down. Gray forms closed in around them, guns and bayonets at the ready. Arquette was hit by bullets, but he laughed at his attackers, his immense and terrible joy bridging the ages between the past and this moment. With a loud and nameless laugh, he leaped at the enemy like a huge cat, shrugging off their bullets and bayonets as he fought on. Bayonets were nothing but straws to Arquette as he faced his enemies. They were appalled and gave way as he swept and lunged at them, killing one and splitting another's skull before the first had even fallen. He lifted and upset a third, goring him like a bull in one swift stroke. The 4th and final member of the group ran in close, screaming with terror and fury, firing as he ran. But Arquette tripped him and swiftly transfixed his bulging throat with his steel blade. Brewer was down, but Purcell had been reinforced with soldiers in brown who came running, shooting, yelling, and brandishing their weapons. They closed in on the Germans, and Arquette ran into the melee, thrusting at each gray form he encountered. American yells echoed along the line as the enemy gave ground. Arquette saw the gray line waver and reserves running to aid his squad. The Germans would be beaten back. Despite the whirling blackness in his head and the dust and blood choking him, Arquette let out a hoarse and harsh laugh. Another gray form blocked his way, but Arquette saw only the arms reaching out with a bright, unstained blade. His own bayonet clashed against it and locked, feeling the helplessness of the arms that wielded it. In that instant of pause and heaving, breathless exhaustion, the petrific mace of primitive man stayed at the return of the human, and Arquette spent his madness with a supple twist, using the French trick to powerfully lunge at his foe with all his weight, driving his bayonet through the enemy's lungs. "Kamerad!" came the strange, strangling cry as the weight of the body sagged down on Arquette's rifle. He did not pull out the bayonet, but as it lowered with the burden of the body, his eyes, fixed at one height, suddenly brought into their range the face of his foe. As a young boy lay dying on the end of his bayonet, Stan Arquette's soul experienced a resurrection. He stared at what he knew would be his final act as a soldier, his mind coming to a halt. All he could see was the ghastly face of his enemy, expecting to see hatred in his eyes, but instead finding a love of life that had been suddenly reborn, suddenly surprised by death. "God save you, German, I'd give my life for yours," Arquette cried out, but it was too late. He watched as the youth's fingers grasped at nothing, his last moments of consciousness focused on his conqueror before he finally quivered and died, sliding back off the rigid bayonet. This was the war of men. Suddenly a heavy thud sounded to Arquette's left, and a burst of light hid the face of his German victim. A powerful wind lifted him into the air, sharp and hard as nails, throwing him into a roaring blackness that enveloped him completely. Chapter 29.